McInnes. I went to a parliamentary reception on Monday with the National Association for Indigenous Funding Associations or bodies. And one thing that I took away from that evening, and we've been told this previously in this panel, is access to credit. Funding remains particularly difficult for Indigenous communities, especially when one seeks to help women to kickstart business projects. So what recommendations would you offer to us? Is that something that you hear about? How can we, in fact, promote access to credit for women?
Currently, under the Indian Act, women, Indigenous people, can't borrow against the equity in their homes. We can't leverage any property that's held by a status Indian on Indian reserve land. And until we find a mechanism to enable credit for Indigenous people who are living on Indian reserve land, that's going to continue to be a problem. And Canada is one of the only countries that has this kind of Indian Act that prevents the social, economic, and empowerment of Indigenous people. And until we've found effective ways to address that, while also protecting the unique rights of Indigenous people, the unique relationship to the land, it's an incredibly complicated question, but it is certainly a barrier to Indigenous people and Indigenous women in particular being able to sort of find that entrepreneurial aspect in who they want to be. So I don't know that I have solutions except that they have to be intentional and well thought out. And it extends to Indigenous nations and communities as well, not being able to borrow against their assets. And things like the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program that's being talked about right now is an incredibly positive opportunity for Indigenous participation in large-scale infrastructure projects. So something like that at an entrepreneurial level would be incredibly beneficial. Thank you.
It was very interesting to hear on Monday about an association that works on the economic development of Indigenous populations. And I understand what you're saying, particularly when it comes to reconciliation, of how important it is to speak nation to nation. How is this Indian Act archaic? And how does it, in fact, maintain or keep women in precarity or precariousness? So what would you say in terms of this Indian Act? What are its drawbacks?
The history of the Indian Act in 1857 was that it was the act to the gradual civilization of Indians Act, and then it was consolidated into what is known as the Indian Act now. And the entire foundation of that was to subvert the Indigenous population in Canada and integrate them into the Canadian body without that Indigenous identity attached to it. The history of the Indian Act is very much that systemic removal of our identity and our ability to have a socioeconomic drivers in our own communities and an ability to determine who we are as individual communities, as nations, as people. That's a pretty horrific history to think that we still have legislation to that effect on the books. However, it is also the act that protects the rights of Indigenous people in unique ways, and it's certainly not something that can be removed wholesale. But there are a number of opportunities to create off-ramps that Indigenous nations can opt into instead of the Indian Act to replace that legislation. And I think that's probably the best opportunity that we have right now to start to address these issues, but potentially finding ways to create credit opportunities with the equity that we have in things like our homes and our land in order to participate in the economy would be, to me, the next stepping point.
Interesting. Great solutions you've just offered up. And as my colleague said a moment ago, it's very impressive what you're doing. You're working on the energy transition in Ontario, in fact. And interestingly, last Thursday I attended an event for a women's entrepreneur network. It was part of International Women's Day, and it took place in a suburb of Montreal. And what was interesting was that during that panel, a representative from BDC and other stakeholders and advocates, including the director of this women's advocacy group in Quebec, Ms. Bachand, said just how important and interesting it is for women to be able to engage in sustainable development and to be entrepreneurs and business women in their own right. What are your thoughts about women's role in advancing technologies, especially as part of a green transition, i.e. women's leadership role?
I see a great opportunity on the energy transition conversations that I've been a part of. Women have a different perspective on long-term planning, and I think that's a real opportunity that needs to be leveraged and included. My experience has been, not wholesale, but mostly, that women are looking to plan for their children and their children's children and many generations into the future. And this culturally resonates with me as an important aspect of what energy planning needs to look like. We can't focus just on 2035 and 2050. We have to continue to focus on what comes next and innovate to make sure that we are being respectful of climate change and creating that space and
Perfect. Thank you so much. We're a little bit over time there. So I'm now going to move it over to Leah Gazan online, and she'll be there for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is for Madame Watang McInnes. In the last Parliament, we passed Bill C-15 to make sure that all legislation going forward was compatible with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Since the passing in the last Parliament, at every angle, the current government has tried to fight against it. The first example was with the childcare legislation that to include free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples on all matters, all decisions and matters impacting Indigenous children, which we managed to get through committee in spite of the Liberals. The most recent example that actually happened this week was with a private member's bill, Bill C-318, which I attempted to amend so that it would be consistent with Bill C-15 to change the adoption framework to include kinship and customary care. Currently in Manitoba, 90%, for example, of kids that are currently in the child welfare system are Indigenous, many of them cared for in kinship and customary care arrangements like by grandmothers, aunties. How is kinship and customary care supporting that through EI regimes, including that as part of shifts in EI regimes important to supporting Indigenous women in the workplace?
Thank you, Leah. I think it's incredibly important that we have the opportunity for kinship care and recognition of the cultural relationships between family that we already have that exist, and being able to support those women and recognize that they also need access to things like childcare and the support of community and policies that support the ability to continue to do both. There's not an Indigenous person in Canada who isn't in some way impacted by the child welfare system. It's just a fact. It's a fact we all face on a regular basis. And Indigenous governance, Indigenous chiefs and councils, First Nations governance is consistently dealing with how do we ensure that there's connections between children from our communities and their culture, and how do we maintain that? And the more support there is for kinship care and child care in our communities, the more opportunity there is to continue to pursue that.
Just following up on that, we know through the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls that the child welfare system is a direct line and called a pipeline into becoming murdered or missing. Certainly, I see that in the community I represent in Winnipeg Centre, where, we had the tragedy that started the whole national inquiry when young Tina Fontaine was murdered in our community. How is a failure of governments to deal with things like amending the Indian Act like they're doing right now with C-38 incrementally to ensure that Indigenous women have the same rights as other women in the country, not including us in EI regimes? And I say us because the care primarily is done by Indigenous women. It impacts Indigenous women. How does this place us at greater risk for things like gender-based violence, difficulties with obtaining employment, and difficulty with obtaining housing, and so forth?
I think as the primary caregivers, Indigenous women as primary caregivers in our communities for Indigenous people generally, for our children. It's a real struggle. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to read the book If I Go Missing. It is incredibly impactful, and it's a demonstration of the fact that this is a real fear for every Indigenous woman across Canada that I might be next. And please treat me with the same respect that you treat non-Indigenous men when there are issues, and please search for me in the same way. It's an incredibly powerful and impactful thing. I'm not sure that I captured your question there, Leah, but it was something that came to mind that I hope you have an opportunity to read.
No, absolutely. I wanted to move on to Madame Cooper. Thank you so much for being here today as well. You spoke about safe and affordable housing. I know my good colleague and very good friend, Lori Idlout, speaks a lot about the housing crisis in Nunavut. She gave an example of how one house in her community is being held together by duct tape. It's that severe. How does this impact women, especially in relation to, being able to participate economically, being able to flee gender-based violence situations if it would occur? And would it help to have a mesh of a guaranteed livable basic income in light of the high rates of unemployment as a result of a limited job market, in addition to affordable, accessible housing in the community, if we're going to really deal with gender-based violence, if we're really going to deal with full participation of women in whatever way in communities?
15 seconds.
Thank you very much for your question. Definitely housing is a foundation to any work that we do or any family situation that our communities are faced with. And I did listen to MP Lori Idlout raise this in the House. And if we don't have the foundation in housing that addresses health, violence, and TB, all these indicators that we see in Inuit Nunangat, we're going to constantly see Inuit women limited in their ability to be in the workforce. I'm sorry that I wish I had more time.
I know, because I know it's such an important answer. So I was trying
to you after.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thank you.
We're now going to start our next round, and our next round will begin with Dominique Vienne for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, and thank you to our guests for being here today to take part in our study. My slogan when it comes to equal rights, but when in fact equal rights are still not actually evident in this country, despite the fact that International Women's Day is on the horizon, and we're all, of course, delighted to speak about it, but things are not advancing quickly enough. I don't have much time, but I'll proceed with Ms. Emily McInnes, if I may. You are a lawyer, you work in the energy sector, you're also an Indigenous mother. What you haven't spoke much about is the role that you play as a leader of your community, a political role, if I understand correctly. So what I'm wondering, in your daily life, how does that role as a woman play out? How is your role useful? And what are the ways that you leverage the attempts at helping women in your community? I imagine you're just like most mothers in Canada. You have a huge mental and cognitive load on you with everything you have to do at home, despite the fact of whether or not you have a good partner who steps up to the plate as well. The fact is that there is a sizable cognitive load. So on a daily basis, as a leader in your community, how is it that you help to promote women's rights and future?
Thank you. So I'm no longer the chief of Curve Lake First Nation. I've stepped back from that role in 2022. But when I was in that role, I had 8 months after my election, and we started dealing with a global pandemic and finding the ways to support families through that, and mothers in particular.